author's opinion about their own work and go, where on earth did that come from? Yeah, I've been there too. Which raises the question, does the author's intent matter? There's a couple of different ways of looking at this. The first is to say that yes, the author's intent does matter, and whatever they say about their work is the final word. The other perspective is a concept called death of the author. The term death of the author was coined by a man named Roland Barthes in the year 1967, and basically what it means is that works of literature don't have just one correct interpretation determined by the author. There could be many potential interpretations, and they're determined by the reader's judgment, not the author's. This doesn't mean that the author is literally dead, although certainly we can't ask Shakespeare for his opinion because he's no longer around. Rather, what it implies is that once a piece of literature is published, the author's opinion about it no longer matters. What's in the text is all that there is, and it's up to the reader to draw their own conclusions based on what they see. Now, I want to be clear that this is not quite the same as the idea of separating the art from the artist in cases where maybe the author is not such a great person and you're a little bit uncomfortable with that. That's a related concept because they both basically say the author as a person is less important than the work that's produced. But Death of the Author is about literary analysis. It's about cases where the author says, this is what happened after it ended, or this is the main theme of the book, or this is symbolic of this and not the other thing. And it's the question of whether they have the final say on things like that. For example, Ray Bradbury, the author of Fahrenheit 451, once famously said that the book is not about censorship, it's about TV taking the place of literature. With, of course, the idea that TV is of lesser quality than literature and that a shift towards more visual forms of media is automatically a shift towards a less intellectual society, which that's a completely different can of worms that we are not going to get into right now. My point is that almost anyone who reads Fahrenheit 451 thinks that it is about censorship. It's literally about a dystopia in which books are banned and burned. It's about censorship. But, of course that brings you to that question of whether what the author has to say about it is the final word or not. A couple of points in favor of the death of the author concept. First of all, it's impossible to know for sure what the author's intention was. Even if the author is still alive and still talking about their books, what they say may contradict itself. They may not always present the same opinion on things. And you don't know for sure that they're being entirely honest about what they intended to say. For example, I would guess that it's probably pretty common to say, I wasn't really trying to make a political statement with this, I was just telling a story, or things like that. Another reason you might favor this way of looking at things is because it's possible that the author intended to do something but didn't quite get there. Not all books are well written, not all symbols are effective, not all themes are well developed. So just because the author says they meant for something to be a certain way, doesn't mean that it actually effectively comes across that way. It's also completely possible that the reader sees something that the author didn't intend, but it seems to be a valid interpretation that you could make a strong case for. Not everything that goes into a work of literature is necessarily a conscious decision. The author may not have intended for something to be a part of the story, but maybe it's there, and therefore it's worth talking about. And then, of course, every reader brings their own life experience and perspective to the process of reading, and that can sometimes shape the way in which you view or interpret a text. Sometimes that has to do with the way that society and social norms and values change over time. For example, modern readers, when reading something by Jane Austen or Charles Dickens, will probably view things in a somewhat different way than a reader in the 19th century would have. Sometimes that can just have to do with having a different perspective or life experience in the present day. For instance, I know that there are a lot of jokes out there on the internet about how male authors often don't really know how to describe female characters very well. So a woman reading that book might view that description in a completely different way than the author intended it. On the other hand, it's one thing to say that the author is not necessarily always right, or that their perspective may not be the only valid one. But it's another thing to say that nothing about the author's background or perspective or intention matters at all. So let me give you an example of this. C.S. Lewis is most well known for his series, The Chronicles of Narnia. And if you read The Chronicles of Narnia from the perspective of understanding that C.S. Lewis was a very devout Christian and had also written serious works on the topic of religion, you see a lot of religious influence in The Chronicles of Narnia. But if you read it without knowing that, particularly a lot of kids read it without knowing that, and completely miss it. I completely missed it when I was in 4th grade. But now it just seems so obvious because I've also read Mere Christianity and I know what C.S. Lewis's opinions were on a lot of things that somehow leak their way into the Chronicles of Narnia, even in places that you wouldn't expect. That's a whole different topic for a different video. But do you see how reading it, understanding a little bit about the author's background and intentions makes it a very different reading experience than going into it without that knowledge? With that in mind, I think it's fair to say that understanding the author's intention can be relevant even if you disagree with it. Like, let's say that you're reading the Chronicles of Narnia, but you're not religious, or maybe you are religious, but you don't have the same set of beliefs that C.S. Lewis did. It can still be worthwhile to know what his beliefs were and the way that they influenced his writing, even if those are places where you're going to go, okay, hold up a minute, that doesn't sound right. Or circling back around to the Fahrenheit 451 example. Knowing that Bradbury said it's about TV taking the place of literature, then you can read it and see the places in which the censorship and the bad quality TV kind of weave together to make the society dystopian. Because that is a part of it as well, even if, like most people, I tend to think that it's mostly about censorship. The reason that nobody really cares about or protests the ban on books is because they don't care anymore, because they have lost themselves in the world of meaningless television shows. Another point that I want to make, not so much against the concept of the author's intent not being the be-all and end-all, but more against the idea that all interpretations are valid, is that they're really not. It's totally possible to just have no reading comprehension and to get something out of a text that's just not there at all. So I would say that what matters is not so much that your interpretation aligns with what the author said. You need to be able to point to the evidence as far as where you got that conclusion from. Just because you have an interpretation doesn't mean that your English teacher has to give you an A, or that random strangers on the internet have to agree with you just because, death of the author. That's not how it works. You still have to back your point up with evidence. And then I also wanted to mention, it's way easier to go the death of the author route if the author is in fact dead. If the author is still alive and still writing in that series or still posting on social media or giving interviews, it's a lot harder to say that the author's intent doesn't matter, because the author's intent could, in fact, shape what happens in the future and put things in the main text of the story that go against your interpretation. Now, I won't say that you can't implement this kind of way of looking at literature on an author that's still alive, because, hey, just ask Harry Potter fans. But I will say it's a lot harder, and it's a lot more of a conscious choice than to say, we don't know what Shakespeare meant by this, but I think it's X, Y, and Z. So I guess kind of the main takeaways from this are that authors often have opinions about their own work that they express outside the context of the actual book that they published. And depending on which point of view you take, those opinions may be the be-all and end-all of literary analysis, and if you disagree with the author, you are wrong, or they might be just one potential interpretation, and yours might be equally valid, just as long as you can back it up with evidence from the text.